Well, hi everybody, and welcome to this first panel session today. We're just waiting on Tim Praill, who is our chair, just to join us. He's having just a couple of issues getting joined at the moment. So please be aware, stay with us for a minute or two while we just get that organised. We'll just go on mute on our cameras, on our mics here, guys, and then once Tim comes in, we'll get underway. Apologies for the short delay, but we'll get underway shortly. Thank you. Tim's come in as an attendee, that's why, and he needs to come in as a speaker so that we can. Hi, Sheree. Tim's just come in as an attendee, Sheree, so we're just trying to get him in.
Great. What we might do, just whilst everyone...
Tim's just come in as an attendee, Sheree, so we're just trying to get him in.
Right. I don't know if everyone can hear an echo at my end. Whilst Tim's just logging in, maybe I might hand over to Tim and Simon to introduce themselves to the participants. Great. What we might do, just whilst everyone...
Tim's just come. Sorry, Sheree, go again.
Hi everyone, sorry about the echo, I had two tabs open. Tech 101, what not to do. Whilst Tim's just logging in again, Tim, can I hand over to you to just do an intro to for yourself, and then Simon, if you can join in on that as well, please.
Yeah, sure, no worries, Sheree, and thanks for having us. And if this sums up 2020, I don't know what else does. This has been our life over this year. My name's Tim Rawlings. I'm the head of training product development at PwC Skills for Australia, and do a lot of work in the national vocational education and training sector, as well as work with private organisations on their upskilling needs, particularly in response to automation, AI, and technology improvements as well. So in terms of micro-credentials, clearly an important part of the future of education and the way that we'll upskill, and looking forward to the discussion. Simon?
Thanks, Tim. Simon Eassom. I'm the Executive General Manager for Education at CPA Australia, where I've been for 2 years. I started out life as an academic, in fact, as a teacher fellow in the UK, and really pushing back in the 90s and the early 2000s, bite-sized learning, small consumable chunks of learning, long before the concept micro-credential was created, and then worked for IBM for 13 years from 2005 onwards, where with IBM we developed a massive open credential framework. In fact, earlier this year, IBM announced the award of its 3 millionth micro-credential in the market. So it's one of the big early players in that space. And I've carried that forward to the work we've done with CPA Australia, in that we have developed a whole micro-credential framework this year, and we've launched a whole suite of micro-credential products. So we see micro-credentials as a really important part of the future of learning and the continuous professional development of our members.
Awesome, thank you. Tim, I can see you're here now. We've just done intros, so I might hand over to you, and Jen has just popped in as well. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Sherry. Thanks, Grant. Can you hear me okay? Okay, fantastic. Just an introduction for myself before we introduce Jenny. My name is Tim Praill. I'm COO for Faethm AI. We're a data science company focused on preparing the world for the future of work. We provide organizations, large employers and governments around the world with the information they need to evolve their workforces in the face of technology and other workforce factors. So headquartered in Sydney. In a previous life, I was head of strategy and transformation for Navitas, ran their venturing arm. That's how I became aware of the micro-credentialing market and the impact that it was having on both education, but also pathways of lifelong learning and preparing people for future jobs. On the panel today, we've got Tim, Simon, but also Jenny. And Jenny, it would be great if you could introduce yourself.
Sure, thanks. Jenny Lambert. I'm the Director of Employment and Skills at the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry.
Fantastic. So micro-credentials are a topic that I guess have become increasingly used, but often abused. So they mean a lot of things to different people. So maybe we should start by making sure that we're using the same language. So maybe Tim, why don't we start with yourself and micro-credentials for you, how would you define the term and how would you see it used in modern society?
Yeah, look, it's a really good question, Tim, because depending whether you're talking about the nationally accredited system or whether you're talking about sort of just the concept of bite-sized learning, I think people use the word interchangeably for multiple different things. I think it actually encompasses all of those things, anything that is below or a subversion of what we would traditionally think of a long-form qualification. That could include single units of competency or nationally accredited skill sets. It could be enterprise-based certifications. It could be badged credentialing within organisations as well, or in areas like mining or automotive, it might be manufacturer type certification. So ultimately, they will have value in whatever sector they operate in. They don't sit outside the context of their sector, but it could be any of those things. But I think it's an important question to make sure that we clean up our understanding of what they exactly are.
And Simon, would you say this is just rebadging something that's always happened in the professional body space? You know, you have members, they need certain ongoing professional development. Is just micro-credentials a way of describing this, or is it a fundamental shift in how organizations like yourself operate?
Well, there's two things there, Tim, and I think we're at a key point in time. Yes, I mean, micro-credentials have actually been around for quite a long time, over 10 years. The clue is in the two words, micro and credential. The thing is, it's been a bit of a wild west in that, there's no laws, there's nothing governing it. Anybody just issues anything, and it can be for 30 minutes of work. It can be for prior experience where you do nothing, or it can be for quite an extensive piece of coursework with an examination. So I think the key at the moment is really trying to tie up all the work that's been done in short form credentials. And it's important that we use that word credential, because this is not qualifications. This is where people want to be able to demonstrate competence in an area which adds to their credentials, it adds to their expertise, without necessarily forming a part of or a national qualification that comes under all sorts of different regulations. So it is a little looser than a qualification. So it is a credential. But I think what's happening now is we're starting to see a common language. And that's the most important thing. What is that common language or framework? And what we've done at CPA Australia is we've tried to very much tie the idea of micro-credentials to the AQF and tie it to the tertiary sector in terms of what would be a commensurate unit of study. So we consider micro-credentials to be anything of 120 hours or less of learning, but as a minimum, probably 5 or 10 hours. In fact, we don't issue micro-credentials for anything less than 20 hours. But we would like to see a standardization across a notional number of hours of learning. And that's a notional number of hours of learning for somebody who's a complete beginner to that subject or new to that subject or whatever level they're doing. So you don't have to do that hours of learning. If you're already competent and already have prior experience, you might not do it. But also assessment that aligns that credential to the AQF. So we've taken a particularly, I suppose, narrow look at micro-credentials, that we have very well-defined micro-credentials in terms of hours of learning, and they're all assessed, and they're assessed against AQF levels. So I think we're moving in that direction so that we have a common language across sectors, so that we all know what a micro-credential means.
No, I think that's a very good point. And the one I guess abbreviation you use there, which is incredibly important in the space, is AQF. Now, I think micro-credentialing is definitely a global shift. I mean, it's a mechanism to achieve lifelong learning, which is one of the most popular topics in education technology, future of work space. But when you look at the AQF, it's something that does genuinely differentiate the Australian approach versus, say, the approach in the US. The US is very industry aligned, but it doesn't have the same potential academic framework that underpins it, that allows you to kind of create comparability, allows you to create scaffolding in the same way that we can do if we base everything off the AQF. So maybe kind of opening that line of thought up to Tim and Jenny. Micro-credentialing is obviously a very, very broad area, and it has applications at different stages of somebody's learning life cycle. But the AQF alignment piece, is this something that you see as important? And if so, how are you or other suppliers or education providers that you're working with kind of using the AQF to create that consistency?
I mean, I think it's certainly, it's a provider-driven importance as more than it is an industry-driven importance at this stage. I mean, I think Simon and CPA's example are at the sophisticated end of thinking about the formalisation of micro-credentials in industry. But, that said, short courses and CPD has been embedded within industry frameworks for many, many years. So it's a question of now this terminology of micro-credentials is about, well, how do providers get into that delivery mechanism? How is industry interacting with the recognition of those micro-credentials, and what is that looking forward look like? I mean, so certainly short courses, lifelong learning, upskilling has all been part of the way that employers and industry has been involved in developing for a long period of time. But I think the actual language and the integration of how providers see what they're now delivering in a micro-credential framework is going to be accepted by industry, will be, I think, an ongoing negotiation between employers and industry, in particularly professional organisations, that are driving CPD, and individual providers or providers in general. The link to the AQF is important from a supplier point of view to get that extra credibility into their micro-credentials.
Yeah. So I think we're kind of, if you think about the structure of this panel discussion, I think it's about getting some facts in, introducing the key actors. We define the term micro-credentialing. We've talked about some of the key actors and some of the key kind of language that we're going to use as we discuss this. I think one of the other actors that would be worth exploring is some of kind of the industry bodies, and we've talked a little bit about professional associations. Tim, can you talk a little bit about the work that you're doing with Skills for Australia and kind of some of those other kind of sector participants that have an interest in this space and are exploring the micro-credentialing world?
Yeah, sure. I've got probably two hats on here, Tim, as a PwC employee and what we do as an organisation, as well as our role in the national system. And I think just picking up on Jenny's point there, the difference between the traditional CPD, which has been going on for a long time, and micro-credentialing is about giving it a legitimacy or credibility so that an individual has a portable credential that they can move around the economy with, rather than necessarily keeping the credentials within the remit of a single job or within a single profession. And I note that in the chat that one has mentioned job trainer. I mean, this is a classic example of where, as individuals exit certain roles and find other roles, we need to make sure that these credentials do have rigour and do have some credibility. Now, that doesn't need to be the national system. Here at PwC, we've rolled out a global initiative to digitally upskill our staff in sort of cutting edge data technologies and data visualization technologies, and to get a badge along with that. Now, if industry recognises that and trusts that as a certain level of training, it doesn't need to be linked to the national system. It just needs to have credibility in the eyes of the person that's reading that on a CV. So in order to do that, I think we really need to make sure that rather than being the Wild West Simon talked about before, that there are some rules of engagement, whether or not that's accredited through the national regulated system, or whether or not it's an industry-based understanding. That could be sort of courses, but I think that's the critical point here. We need to transform this, because remember, not everyone works for an organisation that has a structured L&D pathway, and not everyone works in a profession that has a professional body that does that for them. There are millions of Australians who work for small and medium enterprises who probably need to rely on the national system in order to get a rigorous and structured micro-credential pathway.
Yeah. So we'll talk a little bit about like employer links in a second, because I think that's critical, and kind of the industry sponsorship and how would I say, the industry design of micro-credentials and making sure that they're appropriate to close skills gaps into high growth jobs. Like, that's a really interesting area, and we should spend some time on this. But just while we're talking about it, and we're talking about the specifics of creating credentials that not only somebody can passport, but also can attract funding. And I think the whole who pays in education is a really, really important question. And it's something that drives basically the business model of education providers globally. So in this space, traditionally, I guess it's individual pays, it could be corporate pays, but also there's, I guess, an opportunity for government pays as well. And just the question from the audience around Lucas Hakewell, it's a good question. It's got 4 thumbs up, which is a good sign, which is the 1 billion job trainer package calls out funding for micro-credential short courses without including any definition. How should industry be future-proofing for the possibility of future regulation? And I think this is always an interesting space where, if you kind of look at organizations, the bootcamp providers, they've kind of entered the short course market, and their whole business models are reliant on them providing good pathways into employment, and they've been incredibly successful. But when you look at kind of government and at a macro level facing large skill shortages and needing to transition people into high growth industries, government funding starts to become a play, and therefore regulation starts to become a play. So just on the specifics around the JobKeeper package, I'd love to know your thoughts, and I'll open this up to the panel as to who feels best placed to respond to
that. Tim, do you mean the job trainer package?
Sorry, job trainer, not JobKeeper. Sorry,
yeah,
still got COVID on my head.
So, there's too many jobs out there. No, that's what we want, more jobs. But either way, the job trainer package definitely, in terms of recognising skill sets as, the vet language for micro-credentials, if you like, or it predated the micro-credential, I think, terminology big time. There is opportunities there for government to play a role in funding skill sets, and it's an important opportunity. And as long as the skill sets are job-facing, they can also be enabling, but most importantly, job-facing. For example, you could take out of a food and beverage certificate to a skill set that relates just to barista, training or the like. So, you can do skill sets where you're really only, getting a handful of units that are delivering, job outcomes, and that's obviously what Job Trainer is trying to do. So I think there's, where they're formally going to lead to employment outcomes, I think that's the ideal way that government can step in and provide that opportunity for people who need to either transition from one job into another in terms of careers and changing careers, but also for those that are entering the market for the first time, there's an opportunity there, to provide some skill sets and get government funding in for that. So I think it's primarily in cases where people are not currently employed, and there's a public good, if you like, there's a public benefit in the provision of funding, will be much more likely than the provision of skill sets within existing workers, because obviously that the government would primarily see that as the role of the employer to fund the skill sets, except in cases where there may be co-contribution funds.
I think that's a key thing. There's kind of different audiences that potentially want to achieve different goals through this, and government funding has traditionally supported some goals and not others. So the professional development market, individual pays, corporate pays, a lot of very good businesses emerging in that space to support that market. The marginalized and the people that are struggling to get into the world of work, the government still has a very important social role in that. I guess the other one would be school leavers, and getting a sense in terms of school leavers, alternatives to university, creating kind of pathways into roles which doesn't incur the traditional Commonwealth funded debt levels. Like, before we get on to the professional development space, which is where I think we'll spend most of this conversation today, does anybody have any thoughts on that K12 lever space and kind of the potential for government to step in to fund shorter courses that provide pathways to employment?
Well, Tim, let me answer that from a slightly different perspective. I think we have a number of problems that are emerging, and regardless of what's been around for years, the way that's coalescing into some issues, I think, is new. And I think we're at the end of what I call the cognitive achievement era. Now, many of us are old enough who were working in the business or the sector back in the early 90s remember a big push by governments, Australia, the UK and others, to get as many people into the tertiary sector as possible, particularly into university. There was an assumption that by upskilling people around their cognitive achievement, taking degrees and so on, we would increase productivity. Well, the evidence has shown that that has not increased productivity, and there has been no direct correlation between the cognitive achievement of our citizens and productivity as a nation. And so I think we're slowly and quietly seeing an end of that cognitive achievement era, because we're moving into a skills economy, and we're moving into a world where not only is industry frustrated that it doesn't understand what graduates can do, it doesn't know what skills they have. It has a testimony of what they've studied, but it doesn't really have that nuanced understanding of what it means they can actually do. And Tim will experience this at PwC, and I experienced it at IBM. You would spend 18 months to 24 months training your graduates who came into those big companies, because they really didn't have job-ready skills you needed in those businesses. And so you're seeing a slow backing away from that sort of cognitive achievement assumption about productivity. But the problem that we're faced with then is, we've got a whole raft of jobs, and we'll call them new collar jobs. Ginny Rometty, the former CEO of IBM, coined this phrase. They're not blue collar jobs, and they were not white collar jobs. So they're not jobs that automatically are for school leavers or for people who've done a bit of vocational training without any further tertiary qualifications, but they're not jobs for people who need a degree. They're this combination of somewhere between the two. So how do you demonstrate that people have competence or skill in those key areas that the employer needs, when the only formal way previously is they had a degree certificate or they had some other form of qualification from the TAFE sector? So they need a more granular view of what those skills are. Now, so that then leads to very big implications for the secondary sector. I still firmly believe that many of our root problems are that we need a massive overhaul of our primary and secondary education sector. We still deliver this liberal arts kind of education without focusing on job-ready skills, and people will defend that. I mean, I'm an educationist, so I come from a background that people will defend, and that's not the job of school. Our job is to actually, mature young people into a world of independence and rational thinking so they can make their own choices and decisions in life. And it's not about preparing them for a job. We're not a training mechanism for pushing people into jobs. That used to be the old tripartite system of schools that, where kids left at 16 and went into factories and so on. So I do think there is an issue for our secondary sector. How are we beginning to equip people with the skills? And I'll give you, before I hand off to somebody else, I'll give you one clear example. We're now saying, look at all the calls now for things like what we call soft skills, ability of people to take a large amount of information, to be able to resynthesize that information, to be able to make decisions on the fly, to be able to then actually conduct a process that's based upon information and data, and to follow that action through and deliver on a product, and all these sorts of skills, which are saying we don't know whether people have them or not. So how do we measure those? What sort of credentials can we give to show that people have those skills? And you look back at it and go, well, that's a London taxi driver. Now, 30 years ago, you would have said a London taxi driver is an unskilled job. You didn't need any skills. You didn't need qualifications. But you look at the skills we're now saying are absolutely needed by industry. And they're the very skills that we decried, 30, 40 years ago and said they're not relevant. You need cognitive skills. Now we've flipped around, but we don't know how to measure them, and we don't know how to deliver them, and we don't know how to standardize what it means and what people should have. And not only that, but they're liquid skills. And by liquid skills, what I mean is, what defines having that skill will change every couple of years or 3 years. So we are moved away from an era that said, set and forget. I've got a degree, move on and work. No, The skills you have demonstrated and proven you have, you're going to need to reprove and redemonstrate, because the nature of those skills will change, because they're liquid and will move over time. And these are big challenges for the whole education system, which is why I think we've got a very, very interesting period ahead for the next 5 to 10 years of just how young people engage with the micro-credential economy as opposed to going to university. And I think there are really big problems for the higher education sector ahead.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think kind of often during these panel discussions, which can get into very broad topics and get into very interesting areas, you kind of have to take stock at certain points in the conversation. And I think what we've kind of discussed today is we've discussed that micro-credentials can mean different things to different people. They have applications from right down in K12, right up through to retirees who want to not necessarily reskill to access work, but reskill because it's important for their cognitive development. But I think if you kind of look at that spectrum of lifelong learning, it's a very big space. And we've talked in terms of micro-credentials playing everything from being quite rigorously defined, being able to scaffold in traditional qualifications, to being shorter unaccredited courses, which are kind of very, very targeted around a specific job outcome. So it's a big space. And I think to explore the big space through a short panel, it can mean that you diffuse the conversation too much. So I'm going to zero in on a few areas. So the first area I'm going to zero in on is the role of industry in this. We've talked about K12, and it's a perennial challenge, right? Which is that K12, higher education, we know that it needs to change in order to better meet lifelong learning, set people on the path to lifelong learning objectives, but also make sure that you meet the needs of industry. But the thing I've seen over the last 5 years is industry really stepping up and being more vocal about what its requirements are, and private providers stepping in to kind of better meet those requirements. So the role of industry in defining micro-credentials or defining skills outcomes that can be achieved through an education provider, I'd love to focus the conversation on that in for a few minutes. And maybe Tim, will start with yourself.
I actually think, Jenny, you'd probably be a much better place to start than I would be, and I might dovetail off you.
Perfect. Get somebody to answer it, and then you agree. Perfect.
Well, I think that it's a slightly different. The role of industry in that is slightly different, whether you're talking about the vocational education and training system or higher education. So I think that's the first differential point, is that obviously industry's role in defining the skill sets, are built around a system. There's a formalized system that creates those skill sets, and I think that is about making sure that the skill sets are ones that are job focused. So I think that's the issue. As I say, with higher education, I think it's that is really, as I started my contribution today, is more about negotiation between industry and industry sectors and individual providers about how they see the benefit of the skill sets. But I also would like to come back to that question you asked about the role of skill sets or the role of micro-credentials or skill sets for K-12 as well, and say that I think you'd have to say that school leavers, the ambition that industry would see is that they still is aiming towards a formal first qualification. I mean, it's skill sets are if you're trying to enable people to get jobs that they haven't been able to, but obviously, ideally, formal apprenticeship and traineeship pathways in VET, or qualifications that will lead to jobs is the ideal thing for a K-12, rather than pushing a whole heap of people straight out of school into skill sets. So I think that's, that would be. But if they haven't been able to get a job and they haven't taken formal qualification, that's a different role. So I think the role of industry in that is, I think, to provide guidance to the systems, both the higher education and the VET system, as to what are the best pathways into jobs. And that may be formal qualifications and it may be skill sets, and it really depends on the situation of where the learner is up to, and also what the needs are of industry. I mean, as we're seeing increasingly in industry, I mean, whether it be in building construction, there's a whole range of increasing shifts towards specializations. Do you need a formal qualification? Do you just need particular skills in particular areas? And I think a lot of that will drive, but in VET, that drives it through the industry reference committees and into the skill sets. So I think that's there's some different mechanisms by which industry provides advice here.
Tim, your thoughts?
I'll be a bit provocative.
Sorry, go on,
here.
Simon.
I'll be a bit provocative here in response to Jenny, although I agree with a great deal what Jenny's saying. We are really seeing a rapid change, an accelerating change that is going to see a world of work in 5 to 10 years is fundamentally different than it is now, if not sooner. And what that means is the traditional way in which we've defined the skills and requirements for an occupation are completely going to be disrupted. So, our whole, and I notice the word qualification gets used a lot, qualifying you to do X. Well, those boundaries around what delineates and determines what that job X is are all being eroded. And so you're starting to see that what is required are a broader set of skills in almost every single job or in every single application. So even if you are what previously was a plasterer or a bricklayer, you've now got to be, you've probably got to be tech savvy around how you're managing your invoices and accounts and payments and, and all those other systems and how you're getting your customers, whatever else it is, if you're self-employed. So a lot of skills are giving you a broader access to different jobs where the underlying technical requirement is going to be diminished. And we just have to even look at those things. You think, well, surely there's going to be industries that are fairly resistant to that, like the building industry. Well, you just got to look at 3D printing and where we'll be with 3D printing, in a few years' time. It might be 10 years, it might be 20 years, but how will that change those industries? So I think this is where this notion of qualification and a defined framework to go through, whether it be vet training or whether it be a degree program into an occupation. And the biggest area where this is going to impact are the professions. In accounting, we're looking at this in accounting all the time. The idea of an accountant is going to disappear, but accounting as a business requirement is going to increase. But the skill sets you have to bring you into that accounting space are going to come from a more diverse background, for people with data science, with business intelligence and so on, not specifically trained as what we previously thought was an accountant with a qualification that has defined what that role is. And that's the world we're moving into. And that's why I think there's problems ahead. I'm not saying we have answers, but it is this whole notion of qualification for a very predetermined job, where those jobs themselves are being changed. I mean, I'll go no further than to look at the sort of comments of people like, Steve Jobs and Tim Cook talking about Apple. They now say that the qualifications are irrelevant. They look at what they call reputation markers. If you're a 16-year-old and you've already had 3 companies where you've sold software products that you've developed as a coder, then I don't care what your qualifications are, I'll give you a job. So, that's an extreme example, but technology is leading that space. The technology sector is saying, if you have the skills and the competence, I'm not interested in qualifications. And now you've got things like Google saying, we will actually provide our own CPD training programs and we will give them an equal status as to somebody who comes with a degree qualification or something else. So you're beginning to see industry push because the education sector is not making the changes it needs to make.
I'd agree with the industry push. And I think your comments earlier on about fluid skills is very appropriate, which is, an industry or a company within that industry understands its needs on a more agile basis than an education institution that's designing 3-year, 4-year qualifications. And, the company or industry designed curricula can stay more agile, more fluid to the requirements than, say, traditional higher education. I think that role of the industry is incredibly important and will only become more important moving forward. We've also had some interesting conversations, interesting chat around the fact that the kind of technical skills and soft skills are becoming more important in decision making. Technical skills are evolving and rapidly changing. How people think, and the point is picking up skills that give you flexibility and agility and allow you to transition between industries and jobs, I think is something that is only going to become more important for people. I mean, I'm sure you see this, Tim, within consulting and other aspects of professional services, that having people that are adaptable and be able to move into different situations and create value for your customers is incredibly important. And finding that growth mindset, finding that agility and flexibility is actually very hard to assess. So before we get into like assessment, which is a big area in micro-credentialing that's probably worth us stopping on, I'd love to know your thoughts on how to identify these characteristics in individuals.
Yeah, first of all, I got to say I'm impressed. This is the first panel of the year where we haven't mentioned COVID yet, so I will. There were two big things that were already afoot when we went into COVID. One was that the world of work was becoming more flexible. And the second thing is routine tasks, and therefore jobs that are made up predominantly of routine tasks were exiting the economy. And COVID has supercharged both those things. So the reason I mention that is because, Simon's point before about liquid skills and the fluidity of needing to constantly sort of upskill. We know that there's this inexorable removal of routine tasks as automation and AI take over, and they'll be replaced by non-routine tasks, non-routine skills to respond to non-routine tasks, which may be soft skills, they may be new technical skills. The fact is we don't really know. We can sort of, and the analogy I use for those who have seen the dish is when they lose the satellite and they just point it at the moon and they say we'll be within a few degrees. We sort of know where we're going to go, but we shouldn't get too hung up on exactly placing our bets on the right squares. What we should do, and what I think micro-credentials are very useful for, is changing our mindset about the way that we learn. Rather than doing big, chunky bits of learning at various different parts of our career, why don't we treat it more like the way that we treat our exercise? For those of you who have an Apple Watch, you'll know that there's a 30-minute ring of exercise on your Apple Watch every day. There's the F45s of the world. We go to the gym 3 times a week, or we go for, why don't we treat our upskilling in that way? And that's where I think micro-credentials have a real way of improving, rather than me sitting here and saying, I need to go off and do a master's in X and agonizing over what X actually is. I can make much lower risk decisions on a day-to-day basis and constantly top up my skills to respond to the tactical and strategic needs of the business I work in now, but also to make me more valuable in the future as well. So if we're having a less institutional workplace, we need a less institutional learning structure. We need to break it down, and we need to make sure that we can sort of take bite-sized chunks of learning and treat it more like the way we would treat our health or the way that we would train for a sport, rather than thinking that we need to do big chunks of learning at various viewpoints in our life.
I think it's a very important point. Like, where in the world would you say that if you have a lifelong learning budget of, say, 100,000, you'd spend 90% of it in the first 3 years of your life? First 3 years of your professional career. It just doesn't make any sense. And I think we are going to see kind of the return on education having a much greater focus. People actually questioning the value of certain educational options and being able to make those judgment calls as to actually, I think I want to spend my money on this, rather than just be pushed into the traditional degree cycle. It does require industries to recognize these qualifications. And I think that's something that I've seen certainly over the last 5 years, industry stepping up and making big signals that they are looking for skills and they are looking for outcomes and not just, letters on your CV. I would like to ask, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really important here obviously it's very clear, and we're in 100% agreement with the idea that, the role of the lifelong learning and the micro-credentials in that space. But it is really important, though, to emphasize that the number one thing that students want out of doing their initial study is a job. So one of the really important things we need to not do is to undermine the initial role that education plays post-school and even at school. Whether it be vetting schools or that transitional way that they deal with schools to higher ed. The most important thing they want out of that process is a job. And we shouldn't see the formal education system, whether it be through the delivery of formal qualifications or micro-credentials, we shouldn't see that as the only way that people are acquiring skills. 80% or so of what skills people acquire, and their adaptability and their flexibility and their ability to be able to, transition from one job to another, is acquired in the skills and experience they get on the job. But they need that job initially. And one of the things we're in danger of doing with some of these conversations that people talk about, broadening, the role of the initial qualification or, making it adaptable to a range of careers, is that we're in danger of actually not delivering a job outcome from the education that the person is doing. So I think we've got to be really mindful of making sure that, we continue to focus on what is the most important thing that you can do in the initial education post-school experience that will allow people to get jobs. and whether it be through existing apprenticeships, traineeship pathways, or whether it be through institutional-based delivery at both higher ed and vet. But the number one thing is for them to get a job. Then it's a combination of the skills and experience they learn on the job, alongside of the lifelong learning opportunities they'll either get within the workplace or doing micro-credentials with providers, or a combination. So I think we've got to see the role of it collectively rather than the education system producing the solution, completely, because they're not the only things delivering skills.
I'll just add one more thing to that, because I think it's really important. Simon, I'll just move to you. Is we talk a lot in terms of absolute terms, and this is also something that I've tried to do a couple of times through this panel, is to kind of introduce the term micro-credential, help us to define it, and then kind of help to have these stop checks, because in reality, it depends. As with most things, it depends. This is just a different lens of looking at the whole education landscape. It's incredibly complex, multiple actors, multiple different stages of learning, multiple outcomes. And, we've had some good chat on the side about people who are saying, well, if you want somebody doing surgery on you, they've got to attain a minimum level of qualification and skill, and that probably has to have a significant amount of applied learning through a degree, and I 100% agree. And I think the point is it depends. And we also then had others talking about the fact that, on addition to that, the role of ongoing professional development for these more professional qualifications is just as important, and the importance of just-in-time learning. I think the point is it depends, but when it depends, you need to have a framework for understanding it, and you need to have a common language. And I think that's one of the things that Open Learning is doing, and I think it's something that we should try to support. Also, some of the people speaking on the side are also from, say, Deakin University, that's done a hell of a lot of stuff in terms of micro-credentialing and helping to create a consistent framework for evaluating future skills. Simon, before I get on to the final few minutes of conversation, I'll just open it back up to your points.
Yeah, just the comment you made was about industry accepting micro-credentials. I think that the converse is happening. Industry is beginning to reject the standard form of qualification. And you'll see everywhere people saying you no longer need to be a graduate. You can go through every sector. You can go to AT&T in the telco sector. You can go to, Harmansworth Press in the publishing sector. You can go to the technology sector, saying you no longer need to have a degree. So you're even seeing the big four, and Tim will obviously have a comment to make, where they're saying we don't necessarily need you to be a graduate. We're taking people from non-graduate backgrounds. So you're beginning to see industry say we're not getting what we need from the pool of graduates. So being a graduate is no longer the problem. And yet we have this, and Jenny's alluded to it. We've set up a whole mechanism where we've told young people that in order to get a good job, as opposed to any old job, but in order to progress, you've got to have a university or college degree. You just need to read Case and Dayton's book, published earlier this year in the US, The Deaths of Despair. If you do not have a degree in the US, you are X times more likely to be an alcoholic, to take your own life, to be drug addicted, to be permanently unemployed, etc. We've created this massive divide based upon the marketization of the higher education sector, in saying that everybody, if you want to get on in life, you need to go to university and get a degree. We've completely shifted away from the focus of what the university sector is and said it's basically a job factory. And the reality is you're leaving university now with the degrees in all sorts of areas. And what do? You go and become a barista. And so you're seeing that fundamental shift away from a perception of how I will get a better life. Do I need to go to university and get a degree? So it's not about industry embracing microcreds. It's about industry saying we need a different form of credentials in order to be able to identify potential employees that we need who are going to service my business.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think the two things that industry struggle with, because I've been on the recruiting side of industries, which say that I don't need a degree, is I have a quality challenge I have to overcome when I'm screening, and I have to have a relevance challenge. And I think micro-credentialing can definitely solve the relevance challenge. If you have relevant skills from my job and it matches with the job description, good, you meet that threshold. The quality one is still a hard one, where if I have 500 applications for a single job, I struggle to offset that quality threshold, especially for young people that don't have 5 years at Google. And that's something we're probably not going to have time to talk about it today, but it's something that's still in the back of my mind. We have 2 minutes, and I want to wrap up with big thoughts. So the year is 2030. We're in Australia. Micro-credentials in their current form have had 10 years to wash through. how does the market look different? And maybe we start with yourself, Jenny.
Well, I think the comment that was made earlier on is there's no one-size-fits-all answer to that. I mean, I think your comment, Tim, it depends. I think there will be dramatic differences across occupations and across industries, to the extent to which there'll be either major inroads into the replacement, if you like, or the growth in micro-credentials versus qualifications. And there'll be in other occupations not much change. So I think it really will depend a lot on the industry. So I think there's definitely will be a continuing increase in the development of micro-credentials and the use of them. I think that a lot of that will be as much provider driven as it will be industry driven, with the exception of potentially more and more of the skill sets coming into vet to supplement or upskill workers, in that sort of formal environment. So I just think it will be quite a different landscape depending on which industry and occupations you talk about.
Cool. Tim?
Yeah, the analogy I use with this, and picking up on Jenny's point, is, if you have an armada of ships, the national system is rigorous and sturdy, but it is slow as well. And we often look to it alone to do all of the jobs of all of the ships. In 10 years, I would like to see a system where we have an armada that has, small, nimble ships that respond to certain needs. We have big, chunky ships that respond to certain needs, and so that means linking up the national qualification system, national skill sets and units of competency, enterprise certifications, on-the-job learning. All of those work in some sort of seamless manner, so that an individual can get their initial training to get their first job. And then over the course of their career, whether they work for a big organisation, whether they work in a forward-thinking industry, or whether they work for a small and medium enterprise, they can keep building those bricks on their skills, and that those skills are recognised when they go for their next job. That would be the dream in 10 years' time, Tim.
Thank you, Tim. And Simon?
Yeah, I think you just have to look to the US and the federal government there, which is way ahead, unusually way ahead of Australia and the UK and New Zealand in this. I think in the future, you will see national e-learning records, like an e-health record. You will actually see the digitization of every sort of skill and qualification that you have from school through to the rest of your life. And because of that, because it's all digitized and it all sits there on a learner record store, and it's all verified and validated and encrypted and managed through blockchain, etc. So you can actually be confident of the verifiability of those credentials. You will see it. You'll see where the job will find you. You'll see job boards disappear. You will no longer see people needing to search newspapers or seek.com or anything else to literally find jobs available. You will simply find employers find you through that digital record, because they know who's got exactly the skills and requirements that they have. And that will be very, very important in things like the gig economy, where people are moving from job to job and company to company based on that skills register. And the sooner people get onto that, the more advantage they will have in the world of work. But everybody will be using that kind of system in the next 10 to 15 years.
Very good. And final comment from me would be, I think one of the largest companies in Australia will be an education company, and they will have micro-credentialing at their core. So thank you very much for the panel. Excellent conversation. Hopefully we kicked off the Open Learning Conference in good stead. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Jenny. Grant, over to you.
Thanks, Tim. And again, thank you on behalf of everyone at Open Learning for chairing that particular session. Gosh, there was so much back channel conversation going on there. We could go for another 45 minutes just talking through some of those responses that were there as well. Tim, Simon, Jenny, wonderful. Thank you so much. It's certainly gauged a lot of interest, and I think this conversation will continue for a long while after this particular panel session. Folks, and here are your virtual wine and your virtual other gifts that we tend to package up and give at the end of a speaking session. So thank you. The next session will begin at 11:45. Time for a quick toilet break, grab a cup of tea, do what you need to do. And that will be in the main stage with Ash Jones from Deacon Co. So look forward to seeing you at that. Thanks again, guys. Bye.